Live. So, welcome everyone to the Scriptural Mormonism podcast, episode number 68. I'm your host, Robert Bollin. Just in terms of announcements, this Thursday we will have Blake Oster on. We will be reviewing the recent book by Sherlock and Francis Beckwith, A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. We will also have Blake on in the near future as well to critique classical theism in Aquinas' 5 ways. So be on the outlook for that. Today, we actually have a very special guest, someone who I've known for a number of years and read most of his books, and who's not a Latter-day Saint, Dr. Thomas J. Oord. Tom, if you don't mind me calling that, thanks for coming on today. Really do appreciate that.
I'm looking forward to this conversation, Robert.
Yeah, I think some Latter-day Saints, like our mutual friend Blake Oster, have heard about you and really do appreciate your work. I remember encountering you about 15 years ago when you had a free book offer, and I took you up on that and wrote a review of your essay, Indeed, Ontology Creation Made Free. And it's like, oh, this guy actually doesn't believe in creation. I'm 9. I like him. So just maybe in terms of your background, maybe if you were to give a background, say what got you interested in theology, what's your faith tradition? Of course, you come from a Church of Nazarene, so that's a very Arminian type group, which I think Latter-day Saints will appreciate because one Calvinist, now Catholic, once called us hyper-Arminians or Arminians in steroids. So if you were to give maybe a background, say your education and your theology and your interests.
Yeah, I grew up in a little farming community in eastern Washington State in the U.S. It was a community that actually had a strong LDS Mormon influence, and many of my friends from beginning of school to graduation were and are Mormons. And so when I was younger in the Church of the Nazarene, we were taught that Mormons, were, of course, were wrong and they were misled. And so when I was younger, it was a lot of apologetics against Mormonism, making certain arguments that now I regret and that now actually sound a whole lot more like what a Southern Baptist and a Calvinist tradition might want to say about Scripture, about God, etc. But at that time of my life, that's where I was at. And so that's how things go. I then went on to school and got a bachelor's degree in theology at a Nazarene institution, a master's of divinity in the denomination's flagship seminary, and then a doctoral degree in theology and philosophy at Claremont Graduate University. And during that time, I was more and more attracted to process, or what I now call open and relational theology, for what it had to say, not only about the God-world relationship, but for what it meant for grounding God in love, which I had come to believe was the most important aspect or way to approach God, at least from my perspective. It also had great advantages for science and religion issues, religious pluralism, et cetera, et cetera. That journey then has brought me to reject some views of God that many LDS folks also reject, including, as you mentioned, the idea that God can create out of nothing. I also reject the classic views of divine omnipotence, have a strong view of free will. And there's some other views that I have that I think some LDS would approve of, but it's probably not standard in the Mormon tradition. My interactions with Mormons have been pretty diverse, including having some Mormons as my doctoral students. But just recently, I spoke as the keynote speaker in San Francisco at GTU for a conference in which I was the only non-Mormon there on a God as a finite God. And I have had lots of interactions with Bob Millet. And in fact, just at the last American Academy of Religion meeting, I had a nice breakfast with J.B. Hawes, who's at BYU, and have spoken at BYU as well. So lots of connections with the LDS tradition, but I do not consider myself LDS.
Well, we'll see how this interview goes.
That's right. I should add, though, just this last summer, so the summer of 2024, I was kicked out of my denomination, the Church of the Nazarene, lost not only my ordination, but also my membership because I'm queer affirming. So, now that I'm a free agent, we'll see. Come with me with some money or something here, Robert. See what the Mormons can lure me their way.
You just know this clip's going to be taken out of context by everyone.
That's exactly right.
But as I mentioned, I first became aware of you through your work in the book you edited, which is a very good book. Even after like 15 years, it holds up very well. Creation Made Free. So maybe if we were to address, like, say, initially your work on, God's foreknowledge, human freedom, and also, funnily enough, as you mentioned, unlike many, when, like, say, mainstream Christianity, if you will, you don't believe God created ex nihilo or nothing. You actually would agree with Latter-day Saints to at least to the perspective that God did create, but it wasn't, bara and kitsu and others. That does not necessitate ex nihilo. It means like ex materia, out of pre-existing material, or however you want to formulate it. In fact, plug time, you actually do have a book, Creation Made Free, but also a book on creation as well, where you defend and critique creation ex nihilo and defend creatio ex materia. So maybe you were to give, like, say, have you always held that view? What caused you actually do a 180 if you did not always hold that view? And why do you think, like, say, open and process theology is so compelling, like, philosophically, biblically, and why one would have to hold to creation out of, from pre-existing material to actually be consistent in that? That's something that has come out in your essays, on your blog, and so forth. I know that's like a number of things, but like, feel free to, like, as long as you want to unpack that.
Sounds good. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, I grew up in the Church of Nazarene and was a minister in that tradition up until 8 months ago or so. And that tradition comes from the Wesleyan tradition, or the Wesleyan Arminian tradition, which does take free will seriously. It's not compatibilist. It's libertarian free will. Although I like to say it's genuine but limited free will. We're not free to do anything. But that kind of way of thinking was a part of my life early on. There was an emphasis upon God's love, although I don't pretend to have early on thought my way through all the complexities of those issues. And probably like a lot of people, the questions of evil were really important to me. If I wanted to affirm God is loving, then how could I do that if there was unnecessary evil, genuine, pointless pain in the world? And early on, I sort of went toward a free will defense until I found that that didn't answer all my questions about evil. And eventually, I was introduced to this notion in process theology, in which they explicitly reject the view of divine omnipotence. And I was, of course, warned against that, thought that was, people told me that was way too liberal and that it was going to take me down the wrong path. But it just seemed to be the right way to go. And I began then working out for myself how I might want to talk about God's power. And that's been an ongoing project for decades that culminated in a couple of books recently that I might talk about later.
Sure.
But
Just if you don't mind me just asking,
yeah.
when you embraced it, was this before or after the whole furore with the Evangelical Theological Society and them trying to kick out open theists? Was it before or afterwards? I think like the
Process
early
theology?
2000s. Well,
Yeah.
I think like in the early 2000s there was like a movement to get rid of, like, say, Gregory
Yes.
Bide and others. So was it before
Yes.
or after when you embraced it?
It was before.
Okay.
So I started in my Nazarene seminary in the early 90s. The Openness of God book came out in 1994. Pinnock and Sanders then was taken to ETS, and that was later in the 90s. I don't remember, I think 97, 98. I don't remember the exact years.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah. It
so,
was around that time though. Yeah.
yeah. In fact, there's so many anecdotes little rabbit trails I could run down. When I was a doctoral student at Claremont in 1997 or 98, um, John Cobb, a process theologian, invited a bunch of the openness folks, Clark Pinnock, John Sanders, Richard Rice, David Basinger, Bill Hasker eventually came. Anyway, a bunch of those folks for a big conference at Claremont, the open theists and the process folks. And as a doctoral student, they invited me, and it was really a fascinating time because at that time, and still today, but especially at that time, the open theists want to keep a real sharp distinction between what they believed about God's being in time and not knowing the future, and a process view, which explicitly rejected omnipotence, and most of them didn't want to do that. Process folks explicitly, well, most of them explicitly rejected creation out of nothing, and most of the openness folks wanted to retain that. So I was doing my doctoral work and writing my dissertation on these subjects when this conference occurred, and it was really helpful. I realized at that conference that most of the process theists in the room had grown up in fairly conservative or even evangelical communities, and they felt like they had to leave those communities if they were going to stay true to this vision of a loving God who's not controlling. Whereas most of the openness folks were trying like crazy to stay in these evangelical communities. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted to distance themselves from the process people. But my own conclusion after that is that the two groups share much more in common than they have in opposition. And that's why I ended up coining the phrase open and relational theology in the early 2000s as a way to bring together these open theists and the process people at the American Academy of Religion and in other places. And in doing so, some of those lines begin to blur, although some open theists want to strongly, keep a strong line between what they do and process thought. But it was during that time that I first began to ponder why I should believe that God created something out of nothing. And it was the problem of evil that led me to that pondering. Because I reasoned if God can create something out of nothing in the past, God should essentially have that ability in the present. And if God has that ability, then why doesn't God use it to stop the genuine evils in the world? And so that little question began to unravel the traditional doctrine of creation out of nothing until today I have my own version, which I don't quite call it creation ex materia. I call it creatio ex creatione in amore simpi eternaliter, which means creation out of creation in love everlastingly. And it's the notion that God always creates out of that which God previously created everlastingly, and love is the motivation, which I think is pretty compatible with a Mormon view, but has some nuances that maybe is not included in it.
Sure. Before we begin, shout out to my friend Blake Oster. I know you've read his essay as well.
Yes.
He's written like a very comprehensive essay, Out of Nothing, A History of Creation Ex Nihilo in Early Christian Thought. That's a refutation of William Copan and Bill Craig, who's written a lot of stuff on the topic.
Yeah, that's a great. I've read that. I use it. It's excellent.
I agree.
And that Copan Craig book sucks. I mean,
Yes.
if I was an advocate of creation out of nothing, I'd still say it sucks. I just think it's
Yeah,
a
and I think
poorly
Craig's
written
understand
book.
like say God's relationship to time is just like silly and
Well, and Copan's using biblical scholarship that's like 50 to 60 years old, and he's
oh, and same
he's
with
not.
cosmology. Yeah.
Yeah,
Their
it
cosmology
definitely
is dated
sucks.
as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. See, ecumenism in progress here. You
I love it.
But yeah, shout out to Blake, who's probably written like the best article, at least by a Latter-day Saint, but like one of the best out there as well. He also deals with some patristic issues as well, and he has another essay on the Fair website that deals more with cosmology.
Mm.
Thanks an interesting fellow. He knows everything. But so I'm sure, like, because this might come as a shock to like a number of people out there, like people outside the LDS tradition that don't believe in creation ex nihilo, because like the mainstream view, and when I say Orthodox or Catholic, I mean like, lowercase o, lowercase c, has been like God creates out of nothing. It's a dogma in Catholicism, as in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and it's been just assumed to be the case in, like, say, the classical Protestant traditions, just to say, like, classical theism, absolute divine simplicity, just take it as a given, even in the Reformation. So, was this like a common view among, like, say, your then fellow members in the Church of Nazarene? Was this like a tolerable view? And, like, why and I'm sure like the very simplistic, well, it says God created, that means ex nihilo. Maybe if you want to unpack that, because I know you do like your essays in your book as well, how
Yeah.
creation does not have the subtext ex nihilo. In fact, there's a lot of biblical evidence to the contrary and philosophical problems with creation and nothing as well.
Yeah. As a youngster, I don't really remember anyone emphasizing creation out of nothing. Like when I went to Sunday school, I mean, maybe they said it and I don't remember it, but it wasn't emphasized, that's for sure. And even today, I think if you went around to most churches and they talked about creation, someone might say out of nothing, but it's not, no one really, none of the typical people in the pew are working out the implications of that. It's only in the scholarly realm that this kind of discussion seems to occur. And as you said, and even the most conservative evangelical biblical scholars will admit creation out of nothing is not in the Protestant Bible. There's one passage in the Catholic Bible in Second Maccabees that can sound like creation out of nothing, but even there, it's talking about a womb, and a womb is something. Creation out of a mother's
Yeah.
womb, and a womb is something.
Yeah,
So,
and in the Hermeneia biblical commentary to Maccabees, the author actually parallels that with like Greek medical texts that speak about sexual generation. So it
yeah,
doesn't imply ex nihilo. So yeah,
exactly, yeah. But this view seems to have emerged if we take the work of, oh, who's the historian of creation? I'll think
Gerhard
of it.
von Rad.
No, not Gerhard von Rott.
No,
Oh, why can't I remember this guy's name? Anyway, I'll think of it before we're done. There's an important book that was written on this subject in which the author makes the argument that the idea of creation out of nothing first emerges from the writings of two Gnostics. The Gnostics who believed that matter was essentially evil, and it was beneath God to create the world out of matter because God is a holy, purely, other, and doesn't want to be associated with this inherently evil matter. So they come up with creation out of nothing as a way God creates. But then that gets picked up by Tertullian and some of the main Christian thinkers in the second and third, mostly third and fourth, actually, centuries of Christianity. And they couple that notion of creation out of nothing with omnipotence because they want to portray God as supremely powerful. And it seems like it's even more amazing if God can create something out of nothing than if God creates something out of something. And that then takes off. And although creation out of nothing isn't in any of the major creeds that I know, it is a part of the most theologians' views, um, not a part of Scripture, and I think it's the wrong way to think. I think it leads to all kinds of problems, not only in terms of the problem of evil, but in terms of thinking about the inherent value of creation. It leads to problems thinking about ecological matters, like why would God really care about this world if God could just create a new one out of absolute nothingness? It doesn't fit with contemporary science, even Big Bang theory, because Big Bang Theory doesn't answer questions about what happens before the bang, before T0 of our universe. So I think there's all kinds of problems with creation out of nothing, but most people, even in the academy, still accept that view.
yeah. I'm not sure if it's a book you were thinking about, but there's a book by Gerhard May, Creatio ex
That's it.
nihilo.
That's it.
Yeah,
Yes,
I knew it was a
that's it.
German guy.
Yep,
Yeah,
Gerhard
and
May. Yeah.
that's a really good book. One can actually get an affordable copy secondhand, so that's a really good one. Now, you mentioned like a few times like the problem of evil and how that can't be reconciled if you believe in creation and nothing. And you've mentioned previously the free will defense in the classical view. So, like, what is the free will defense? Why do you think that's problematic, if you will? And why do you think like it's the problem of evil is a genuine problem if you believe in creation and nothing, but it can be answered to some degree of satisfaction, at least if you don't believe in creation or nothing.
Yeah, the free will defense, I think, has some partial truths, but doesn't go far enough. If the free will defense says something like, God creates free beings and can't control the free beings God creates. Therefore, God can't control them when they do evil. Then I think we can make some headway. The problem is that there's some evils in the world that don't seem to be caused by free agents like humans. Um, take the coronavirus or the pandemic as a good example. That doesn't seem to be the work of any free human being, especially in terms of how it's spread. And yet, I think it's a genuine evil. It's caused so much harm and killed so many people. But we could add so many other things that are evils that at least we all act as if they're evils in the world. They make the world worse than it otherwise might have been. And so the free will defense, I think, needs to be extended to say that God not only can't control free will creatures like humans and, maybe chimps and dogs and dolphins if they have free will, but also that God can't control even the smallest units of reality, the quarks. Or as I like to say, God can't control anyone or anything from quarks to quasars. God inherently is uncontrolling. Now, there's a number of ways to sort of spin that out. One is to say, God can't do that because there are certain metaphysical laws that govern even divine action. And that's what some process folks like my advisor, David Ray Griffin, would have said. My view, though, is that God's inability to control derives from God's own nature. So the notion is that God's nature is first and foremost love that's self giving and others empowering. And because it's God's nature and God can't deny God's own nature, and because God not only loves the most complex things of existence, but even the simplest, God can't control anyone or anything, simple to complex. That's kind of the basic notion of my views on God's uncontrolling love.
Okay, no, that's interesting, and I think that may be like a good
Oh,
segue. Like, oh, go ahead.
I forgot to bring that in the creation out of nothing stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah.
so, so, so if we one possibility, like I like to consider the arguments that I think are the strongest against mine, the ones that do the most good but don't quite fit what I want to say. And I think the strongest argument against mine might be something like this. God once existed all alone and then for some reason decided to create a universe out of nothing. But after that initial creation, God is somehow limited in God's ability to control others. It's either a voluntary self limitation or somehow it's just in the very nature of things that God can't control what God creates. Um, that's that view is pretty close to mine, except that it affirms creation out of nothing. And I look at that view and I say, well, what makes it the case that God can't control after God created? And if someone says to me, well, it's just the nature of creating something other than God's self that makes it that God can't control, I say, well, who makes that rule up? If God's making the rule up, it seems like God could change the rule if God wants to. And so then it still becomes a voluntary divine self limitation. And if it's voluntary, then God can always have a change of mind. And then someone might say to me, in fact, some of my friends do say to me, um, well, God could create out of nothing at one time, but after that must work with the materials God initially created. And to those people, I say, why? What's the principle that says that? If it's part of God's choice, then again, it's a divine self limitation. And I like to quote my friend Alvin Plantinga here, who does not agree with me and does agree with creation out of nothing, because he's got a great little illustration in one of his books. He says, God has the ability to create from absolute nothing a full-grown horse in Times Square, New York. God could do it, boom, just like that, without breaking any laws of nature, any laws of conservation. Boom, God can just up and do it. And I think Alvin Plantinga is right to think that God could do that today if God did it, 13.8 billion years ago at the beginning of our universe. And I think that's a problem, because if God can do it today, then God should be able to prevent all kinds of evils that occur today by creating something out of nothing to stop, bullets, or to stop this and that or the other. So I think to be consistent, you shouldn't say God can ever create something out of nothing, and that God everlastingly loves others that God creates. I was kind of rambling. Sorry about that, Robert.
Oh no, that's interesting. Some people in the earliest tradition would kind of agree with you. Like, if you believe in creatio ex nihilo, that's a huge problem for the problem of evil. In fact, would often point, like, say, how Joseph Smith explicitly taught against the idea, and how somehow solves the problem of evil. And I'm actually partial to that theology as well. So, of course, like you are well respected amongst like other open theists as well. You know, you're friends with John Sanders and so forth. So, how do they seem to like largely still agree with like say the orthodox lowercase o view, like God did create ex nihilo, but they have correctly, I would argue, a commitment to like say genuine freedom, libertarian freedom, as they would call it. So, how do they actually deal with like say what seems to be a dichotomy between God creating out of nothing and us having genuine freedom, not compatibilist freedom? And have they actually tried interacting with, like, say, your work or the work of others, showing like there's biblical and philosophical problems with the traditional view of creation?
Yeah, people like John Sanders, Richard Rice, Bill Hasker, Greg Boyd, they have engaged my work a great deal, and they have some criticisms of it. A lot of them based on this notion that they think God could still be considered omnipotent and creating something out of nothing at the beginning. And they worry that my view can't account for all the miracles that I think it can account for, uh, etc. What most of them, this is it's hard to give a general theodicy description for a whole group of people because everybody's got their own nuances. But a general open theist theodicy starts by saying, look, we've got real advantages over the Calvinist or classical view because the God we believe in doesn't predestine everything from the beginning, makes genuinely free creatures that God doesn't always control, and doesn't know the future. So God's not absolutely certain that the Holocaust is going to happen. So this God has given freedom and continues to give it, and there are certain consequences to this giving of freedom that God takes on. And they'll sometimes talk about this whole project, the creation project that God has in mind, in which God says, okay, this is the kind of scenario I need to set up if some of these creatures, humans in particular, but maybe some others, are going to have a real give and receive relationship with me, if it's really uh, non coerced. And so they want to go a long way toward the position I get to, but they're worried for a number of reasons that I go too far. One of them is they're really committed to creation out of nothing, and obviously I obviously don't have that. But another one is they really want to believe that God is going to win at the end. They want to have an eschatology in which there's a guaranteed divine victory, and they seem to only be able to have that if God retains the kind of omnipotent power capable of making sure God wins in the end. Whether or not you think that's a universalism where everybody, everything works out right, or some kind of annihilation, or with heaven, or some kind of traditional heaven and hell, whatever view you have, um, it seems like if there's a only way to get a guaranteed eschatological victory is for God to have omnipotent power, and I don't have that kind of God. So, they criticize me for that. I've obviously got some answers to that, but that's how they would start to engage the conversation.
Okay, that's interesting. Now you kind of mentioned like the love of God, and you've done a lot of work on that. You have a book on the top, actually a series of books on the topic, and it seems to be tied into your idea, like say what's called omnipotence. So how would you define like your understanding, say, the love of God, because that's a multivalent term? Like how would that differ from like say traditional views of God's love?
Yeah,
And
love that
maybe if you would
question.
also like maybe address like say your view, like say how that ties into like your recent books and your recent work on omnipotence.
Great. Yeah. So, traditional theology here, by traditional, I mean people like Augustine, Aquinas, Calvin, Luther. There's some nuances between these, so I'm painting with broad brushstrokes for a moment. Traditional theologians have wanted to say that God is love insofar as God benevolently grants positive things upon creation. But because they believe that God's perfection requires God to be immutable and impassible, they have not understood love as a real giving and receiving. There's no relationality in the concrete view of relationality, of a receptivity between God and creation. And of course, I think love as we know it involves that kind of real relationality. And so the classical view, I would say, and many others, doesn't have a God who loves in real, genuine, give and receive relationships. Furthermore, some people, like Augustine's a great example of this, Augustine understands love primarily as desire. And so we ought to love God by desiring God. And God loves only that which is most desirable. And what is most desirable is God's self. So ultimately, God only loves God's self or loves creation insofar as creation reflects God's self. And furthermore, if we are going to be genuine lovers, we should love God above all others. In fact, if we divert any loves toward creatures, that is not the ultimate love, then we have somehow not been loving rightly or properly, or we're loving inordinately, to use the classical language. I think love is better understood and I think biblically supported, not as desire as such or even desire for the good, but acting in relational responses with the aim to promote well being, or what the biblical writers would call blessedness, abundant life, or what philosophers would call flourishing. I think that's love's goal, not desire in and of itself, but the aim for flourishing. So that's a big difference between my views of love and a common view. But you've brought up this word amipotence, and that's a word I made up a few years ago. Ami is the Latin for love, potence for influence or power. So amipotence is the power of love. And in a shorthand way of talking about omnipotence is to say that omnipotence is the power of God's uncontrolling love. So there's something uncontrolling sort of built into the definition itself. And one of the arguments I make is that when we think about God, and as theologians have thought about God throughout the centuries, especially the divine attributes, they have often instinctly, whatever, they've often implicitly, let's use that word, they've often implicitly started with views of God's omnipotence and independence, and then tried to make sense of God's grace, love, relationships, whatever, in light of those two things. So God is essentially all alone. God is essentially either all controlling or able to control anyone at any time. And then they'll understand other divine attributes in light of those primary attributes. I, however, and omnipotence in particular, think that we ought to start with uncontrolling love and then understand God's power, God's relationality, etc., in light of that. If we do that, I think we have a God who can't control and a God who's always related.
Oh, that's good. And maybe if you were like, say, you have some recent, you about a year ago, like a short book came out, and I think you have 2 volumes now on the topic. So, do you want to give like a discussion about those and any other books you may be working on at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, a book came out a year or two ago called The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence. And one big chapter is on how omnipotence isn't in the Bible, either the word or its meaning, and why the biblical translations have made an error in even calling God Almighty. Another chapter is on all the philosophical qualifications that have to be made to omnipotence to try to make any sense of it. And I argue that it dies a death of 1,000 qualifications. A third chapter is on the problem of evil and other experiential or evidential problems that come when we think God is omnipotent. But the last chapter is my alternative. I'm not just arguing against omnipotence. I lay out this amipotence view that I have and what it entails and how it means that God is really powerful, the most powerful force in the universe, but unable to control anyone or anything at any time. So this is not a wimpy God. This is not the God of deism up on the clouds watching us from a distance. This is a God who's really interactive day to day and everything at all times and is maximally powerful, yet unable to control anyone or anything. That book then has generated quite a bit of discussion and argumentation. And just in the last week, two 400 plus page volumes have come out on called Omnipotence Volume 1, Support and Criticism, and Omnipotence Volume 2, Expansion and Application. And I'm indebted to a bunch of editors for bringing together like 140 plus essays in these two books to explore the implications of thinking God is omnipotent rather than omnipotent.
Oh, no, that's interesting. In the final few moments that we have, you've written like a number of books, you contributed like a number of books. So if someone like wanted, like, say, get a good flavor, like, say, the particular takes you have on particular topics, which book or books would you suggest from both yourself and other authors that have influenced you as well?
Great. Well, I've written or edited 30 plus books, so I got a lot to choose from. I think the best introduction to this way of thinking is a book called God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love. Excuse me, I have to splice that out there. The subtitle is How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Evils. And that's been a best-selling book that deals with the notion that God simply can't control people or creation. If you're interested in the creation out of nothing issues, I'm actually in the midst of writing a book on that. But in my book, Pluriform Love, there's a whole chapter that lays out an alternative to creation out of nothing. But it's a subject that I've written about in various books. I've already mentioned the death of omnipotence and birth of omnipotence. If you're a person listening to this podcast and you're not really into the academic stuff so much, and you've already read God Can't, there's a new book that came out this last year that I wrote with Trip Fuller called God After Deconstruction. And it looks at 8 reasons why people are deconstructing their faith, leaving belief, leaving the church, and then 8 open and relational responses to those reasons. And so that might be helpful.
No, that's good. And I think like maybe like say a rapid fire because like you do have like say some other views. What's your views about eschatology? Not like say pre-mill and stuff like that, but what's your understanding of say the reward of the curse, and also what will the incorrigibly wicked face? Do you hold like universalism? Do you hold annihilationism? I think like some may be wondering because usually those in the process open view have other minority views and some other topics as well. So what's your perspective on say that aspect of eschatology?
Yeah, I affirm what I call the relentless love view of eschatology. I think God never sends anyone to hell and God never punishes, but God always offers us love and we can always freely choose or accept. When we choose that love, then we enjoy the positive consequences that come from it. When we don't, there are natural negative consequences that come from choosing other than love, not divine punishment. And I think this ability to choose continues beyond the death of the body. So I believe in subjective experience beyond bodily death.
So would you hold like say posthumous salvation, the opportunity to hear the gospel in the hereafter, some type of like something like say not just like what Latter Day Saints, but even like say Sanders and a few others who are more inclusive than say Calvinists, that there is the opportunity like say to hear or to repent even in like say some kind of intermediate state as well.
That's right. And I would say there's not only the opportunity, but there's always the opportunity. So God never gives up on anybody. There are some open theists who are annihilationists, and I'm not one of those. I don't think God ever stops offering love to every creature capable of responding.
So I know some would think this is guilt by association, but I'm actually a fan of Origin. I think he's really underrated.
Me
So
too.
would it be like not too dissimilar, like say Origin's view, but like he's
Very,
understanding, like say recapitulation.
very similar. Yeah, very similar.
Yeah, so Origin did not wrong, and he was condemned only 300 years after he's dead. So does that really count anyway?
Yes. And man, we would have been a lot better off if we'd followed Origen rather than Augustine. My
Oh,
goodness.
geez, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I know Augustine kind of gets, it's like constantly he gets blamed for everything, but he still like gets a brunt for like a lot of stuff. Like he's understanding like original sin and like infant damnation and yeah, I'm not a fan of Augustine, and that's just because I had to read all his works in English for university. If there's a purgatory, I've got a plenary indulgence.
I love it.
But no, with that, I know you're like strapped for time, so like we can end there. But like, thanks again for coming on. I think this will be rather informative, and hopefully, like, not just like Latter Day Saints who watch this, but others as well. Like, will track down at least some of your works, and even if they will disagree, they're gonna say like, this, I'm kind of glad you said like, say, the God you present and like theists, open theists, and process theologians. It's not like a wimpy God because that's a caricature a lot of people have. It's a knee-jerk reaction. Like, if God does not have all these omnis, he must be this kind of wimpy God, and like he can fail, unless there's somehow preserving free will, he can actually determine everything. But I'm kind of glad you're going to mention that as well in your discussion. So, but I
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
yeah, but you do have like a fan base amongst Latter Day Saints like myself and Blake Oster and a couple of others. So like we really do
Oh,
appreciate the
thanks.
work you do. I'm not sure like if you like, because I know some people think you're a heretic, and this is probably going to make even more people think you're a godless heretic. But you have friends.
Yes, I do feel like I have friends in the LDS tradition. There's a lot of similarities, and so and I appreciate that. I don't. How should I say this? I'm looking for friendship everywhere, so I don't worry about being guilty by association.
Yeah, joking aside, really do appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to come on. And hopefully, people will actually track down some of your works. My personal favorite is, of course, the series of essays you wrote and contributed to, but also your small book on creation, and where you defend creation out nothing. Sorry, you critique creation out nothing, you defend creation. I know you don't like that term, but like ex nihilo materia. I think that's really informative because it kind of shows like it's not just like, say, us and their kind of crazy views. It's like it's an allowable, respectful position. It's not like, say, kind of someone like 19th century backgrounds cult view, So we do
Yeah,
appreciate
well,
that.
and my view is creation ex materia if it's understood in a particular way. I just think that label can sound like God stumbled upon some stuff when God
Exactly.
didn't
Yeah.
first create. So I wanted to find a label that like. I like to use the word creation rather than materials because creation implies it was created. So it's sort of some nuanced differences, but it's generally similar to LDS
No, no,
Christian.
yeah, I would agree with you. Like with the nuance sphere, it's not like, say, even their view, like God just stumbled upon us, like, oh, cool, I can make stuff now.
Yeah, right.
Like,
Yeah.
like like your kids, when it comes across Play-Doh, whatever the US equivalent is, like now I can make Legos or something like that. So,
Yes, yep.
but no, really do appreciate it. Like, and hopefully we can have you on in the near future as well to discuss some other topic. You've written like a lot of very interesting books and essays, but again, really do appreciate like a lot of work you've done in various areas, and hopefully this will be like appreciated by others who watch the episode as well. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, you're welcome, Robert.
Take care. Okay, well, that's the end of the live stream. But thanks again for coming on. I know you're busy, so really do appreciate